Have you ever wondered what silence sounds like before a storm? Not the kind of storm that rattles windows or splits the sky with thunder. I'm talking about a storm of people, of desperation, of courage so raw it makes your heart burn. Tonight, I want you to step with me into Bahia, early 1800s. Close your eyes if you can and imagine the heavy air, the scent of salt drifting from the Atlantic, mixing with smoke from sugar mills and sweat from hundreds of bodies laboring under a sun that never seemed to show mercy. Now, imagine chains clinking. Imagine prayers whispered in languages you don't understand. Echoes of Yoruba, Hausa, Mandinka, spoken in secret corners of the night. Because here, in this land painted with a wealth of sugar and tobacco, the ground was soaked in something else: blood, fear, and resistance. At the turn of the 19th century, Brazil was not yet the independent country you know today. It was still tethered tightly to Portugal. And Bahia was a jewel. Salvador, its capital, was once a colonial capital of all Brazil, a city buzzing with merchants, priests, soldiers, and enslavers who saw themselves as kings in their own little worlds. But behind facades of whitewashed churches and Baroque mansions lay a truth the masters didn't like to talk about. Bahia was a land of Africans. By the early 1800s, the majority of the population was either enslaved or free people of African descent. Think about that for a second. A city where the enslaved outnumbered the free, where the sound of drums in the night was more common than church bells, where the marketplace was filled not only with goods, but with coded messages passed from hand to hand. And with that imbalance came fear. The enslavers feared the people they had chained. They feared the stories of Haiti, that distant island where the enslaved had risen up, slaughtered their masters, and declared themselves free. News of Haiti traveled faster than ships. It spread like smoke. And in Bahia, the enslaved listened. They remembered. Picture this: dawn in the cane fields, the sky barely pale, but hundreds already bending low with machetes, cutting stalks sharper than knives, skin burning, backs breaking, overseers with whips coiling like snakes, their cracks slicing the air and the flesh of those who faltered. Slavery in Bahia wasn't just work. It was annihilation of the self. Children torn from parents, names erased, replaced with Portuguese ones that felt like shackles on the tongue. Punishment so brutal, they barely seem human. Branding with hot irons, mutilation, forced starvation. And yet, even in this abyss, the enslaved carved out sparks of defiance. Hidden rituals in the forest, quilombos, secret settlements of escapees, tucked deep in the mountains. And whispers, always whispers of freedom. Now listen closely. Can you hear it? The sound of footsteps in the night. Bare feet moving quickly across cobblestones in Salvador's narrow streets. A hand knocking softly on a wooden door. Inside, a candle flickers, casting shadows on faces marked by exhaustion and hope. This is where rebellion takes root. In kitchens, in the corners of warehouses, in the crowded back rooms of homes where enslaved men and women, Muslims, Catholics, those holding on to African gods, found each other in the dark. Historians call it the male revolt. But for now, let's not use a textbook name. For the people who risked everything, this wasn't an academic event. This was life or death. They met with scraps of paper covered in Arabic script. They passed plans and coded words disguised as everyday talk. They pulled coins by weapons, knives hidden under sacks of flour. They vowed, with trembling hands, to rise together. And perhaps the most haunting detail, they chose the timing carefully. Their plan was not random. They wanted to strike during a festival when the city would be distracted, when the drums of celebration might mask the drums of war. Now pause with me here. I want you to imagine yourself not as a master, not as a merchant, but as one of them. You've been beaten for years. Your children were sold away. You worked under a sun that has turned your skin into leather and your soul into ash. But tonight, someone whispers in your ear, tomorrow we rise. Would you dare? Would you sharpen the blade, knowing it might cut your master's throat or your own? Would you stand in the night, trembling but refusing to bow any longer? Take a breath. Hold that thought, because this is where our story begins to burn. Bahia's rebellion wasn't just about anger. It was about memory. The men who led it were deeply tied to their African roots. Many were Muslim scholars, people who could read and write Arabic, who carried fragments of books across the ocean, hidden in cloth and sewn into hems. They prayed together, fasted together, wrote manifestos in languages their masters could read. To them, the rebellion wasn't only revenge. It was purification, a cleansing fire. And so they prepared, night after night, weapons stashed, oaths sworn, hearts pounding. And here's where we leave this opening chapter. The city of Salvador sleeps, unaware that beneath its tiled roofs and church bells, a storm is gathering. The enslaved are no longer silent. They are sharpening blades, whispering prayers, waiting for the moment when darkness will turn into fire. What comes next is not just a clash of swords. It is a clash of worlds, a rebellion so fierce, so meticulously planned, that even centuries later, its echoes still rattle the bones of history. So stay with me, because in the next part, we'll step into the night when Bahia caught fire and Forgotten Rebellion began. Have you ever been awake on a night when the world feels differente, when every sound outside your window carries a weight, when even the silence seems to be hiding something? That was Salvador Bahia on the night of January 24th, 1835. The city lay still under a pale moon. The sea lapped quietly against the port. From the churches, the last echoes of prayers had faded. But in the shadows, men and women were not sleeping. They were preparing. Inside a small, dimly lit room, a group of men knelt together. Their foreheads touched the floor as they whispered prayers in Arabic. The flickering flame of an oil lamp painted the walls with trembling shadows. When they rose, one of them, an older man with a scar across his cheek, unrolled a piece of paper. Carefully, he read aloud verses that spoke of liberation, of justice, of the right to fight against tyranny. Every face in the room burned with intensity. They weren't merely planning violence. They were making a covenant with each other and with their ancestors. Knives were passed from hand to hand, rusted, sharp, deadly. A few old pistols lay on the floor, but steel was what they trusted most. Each man held a blade, pricked his finger, and let a drop of blood fall. A silent vow, tonight no chains. Shortly after midnight, it began. A small group moved swiftly through the narrow streets of Salvador. They wore simple white tunics, clothing chosen deliberately, echoing both their faith and their unity. White, the color of purification. White, the color that would stand out even in the darkness. They carried blades tucked under their garments, and courage burning hotter than any torch. The first strike came at a guardhouse. A sentry barely had time to react before a knife flashed and the night exploded with violence. Shouts pierced the silence. The rebellion had begun. Imagine the chaos. Dogs barking, bells clanging in sudden alarm, windows creaking open as terrified families peeked out, unsure of what was happening. Groups of rebels surged through the streets, clashing with soldiers and militia. Flames lit the night as fires broke out in homes and warehouses. The rebels weren't aimless. They had a plan: to seize control of key points in the city, free as many enslaved people as possible, and strike terror into the hearts of their oppressors. One witness later wrote the sounds that filled the air: the cries of the wounded, the desperate calls of children, the pounding of feet on cobblestones. Salvador, usually a city of order imposed by fear, was suddenly a battlefield. Let's pause here. I want you to picture not the soldiers or the masters, but the enslaved who heard the noise at night. Imagine being in a cramped back room, your body aching from a day's labor, when suddenly you hear shouts outside. Rise! The time has come. Your heart leaps. You've dreamed of this moment, whispered about it in hushed tones, prayed for it under your breath. And now it is here. Do you run into the street to join them? Or do you hesitate, knowing that if the rebellion fails, punishment will be merciless? This is a razor's edge they all walked that night, between freedom and death. The rebels pressed forward, chanting verses, their voices rising like a tide. Many were Muslims, and they infused their struggle with the rhythm of prayer. Their white garments shone eerily in the torchlight, making them look almost spectral, like warriors summoned from another world. To the terrified enslavers, it was as if ghosts had risen to avenge centuries of cruelty. But the city was not defenseless. Soldiers rallied quickly. Muskets fired. The sharp smell of gunpowder filled the air. Blades clashed. Blood stained the cobblestones. Every corner of Salvador became a crucible of fire, faith, and fury. And yet, not everyone was ready to rise. Some who had been told of the plan faltered, afraid of the consequences. Others betrayed the rebels, running to warn authorities. It's one of the bitter truths of rebellion. For every hand that grips a sword, another trembles and lets fear win. The element of surprise, so carefully crafted, began to slip. The rebels were fierce, but they were outnumbered. And as the night wore on, their dream of seizing the entire city began to unravel. By dawn, the streets were soaked in blood. Bodies lay where they had fallen. Smoke curled into the morning sky. The rebellion had shaken Salvador to its core, but it had not succeeded in overthrowing the system. The leaders were hunted, captured, beaten. Chains clinked again, this time around wrists that had dared to break them. But here's the thing, rebellions are not only measured by victory or defeat. Sometimes, the power of revolt lies not in its outcome, but in its message. And the message of Bahia's Night of Fire was unforgettable. The enslaved will never stop resisting. So let me ask you, when you hear this story, do you see it as a failure or as a flame that refused to die, even when smothered? Because the masters of Bahia wanted the world to forget. They wanted to bury the memory of that night under silence, under fear. But here we are, centuries later, still speaking their names, still telling their story. The Night of Fire may have ended in blood and chains, but its echoes traveled far beyond Bahia. It terrified the ruling class. It inspired the oppressed. It reminded everyone, enslaved and free, that the line between order and uprising was thinner than a blade. And this is where the story deepens. Because what followed was not just punishment. It was a campaign of terror, trials, executions, and silence. A silence meant to erase the memory of those who rose. But silence can't kill truth. And in part 3, we'll walk into the aftermath. The trials, the executions, the fear that gripped Bahia, and the legacy of those who dared to fight for freedom. Picture Salvador as the first light of dawn spread across its hills and harbor. The city smelled of smoke and blood. Doors that had one stayed shut to the night now creaked open as terrified residents stepped outside, their eyes scanning the streets. Bodies lay where they had fallen. Some were covered hastily with cloth. Others left exposed as warnings. The cobblestones, usually washed by the sea breeze, were stained dark with what could never be scrubbed away. And in that silence, soldiers marched, dragging the captured rebels to the streets like broken trophies. Shackled wrists, backs bent, faces swollen from blows. The rebellion was over, but its shadow had only just begun. Let me ask you, how does society built on chains respond when those chains are challenged? With mercy? With understanding? With an attempt at justice? No, it responds with fear. And fear demands spectacle. The authorities paraded the captured through Salvador as an example. Crowds gathered, some jeering, others silent, many enslaved onlookers staring with a mixture of horror and awe. Among the prisoners were leaders of the uprising, men known for their discipline and faith. Some were still dressed in white garments, now torn and soaked in blood. Their defiance had not faded, even as they stumbled under blows. One eyewitness described how, even in chains, the rebels held themselves with dignity. Some murmured prayers, others lifted their heads high as if to say, "You may bind my body, but you will never own my soul." The governor of Bahia wasted no time. Courts were convened in haste. Judges, priests, soldiers, all worked together to stage a legal drama that would both punish the guilty and terrify the enslaved into obedience. But these trials were never about truth. They were about control. Defendants were questioned harshly, many after nights of torture. Testimonies were twisted, confessions forced. Witnesses were chosen carefully, those who confirmed the narrative that the authorities wanted. That the rebellion was barbaric, foreign, a threat to the peaceful order of Brazilian society. Does this sound familiar? Across history, whenever the oppressed rise, the powerful rewrite the story to make themselves the victims. The sentences were brutal. Some rebels were condemned to public execution. hanged in the main square, their bodies left dangling as a warning. Others were sentenced to death by firing squad. Still others were flogged mercilessly, their skin torn apart before being sent back to toil in chains. And for many who survived, exile awaited. They were deported back to Africa, ripped once again from the lives they had built in Bahia, cast away as if their existence itself was a crime. The authorities understood the psychology of fear. They made sure the punishments were public, theatrical. They wanted every enslaved man and woman to know. This is what happens when you dream of freedom. But here's the paradox. They also revealed just how frightened they truly were. Despite the executions, despite the beatings, despite the silence imposed by terror, the story survived. In whispers, enslaved people retold the bravery of those who rose. Mothers told children about the night when men in white fought for freedom. Workers sang songs that carried hidden references, cloaked in rhythm and melody. The rebellion became legend, not because it succeeded militarily, but because it lived on in memory. Think about it. When a system works so hard to erase a story, isn't that proof of its power? Let's step inside one of those courtrooms. The air is stifling. The benches are filled with local elites, eager to see the rebellion crushed, not only in the streets, but in spirit. At the center, a rebel leader stands, his hands bound, his body bruised. The judge reads out accusations, inciting rebellion, spreading for religion, threatening the peace of the empire. The defendant does not bow his head. Instead, he looks directly at the men who would condemn him. His voice, though cracked, carries clear across the chamber. You may kill me, but you cannot kill the truth. You cannot kill freedom. Gasps ripple through the room. The scribes do not write those words down, but those who heard them never forgot. The day of execution arrived with grim ceremony. In the square, gallows were raised. Soldiers lined the edges, muskets ready. The condemned were led out one by one. Crowds pressed forward, murmuring, some curious, some silent. Many enslaved people forced to watch as living warnings. As the ropes were placed around necks, a hush fell. The leaders of the rebellion did not plead for mercy. Some prayed. Others shouted words of defiance. One was said to have cried out in Arabic, Allahu Akbar, a final cry of faith and resistance. Then silence, then death. Bodies swung as symbols. But symbols are powerful things, and not always in the way the authorities intended. After the executions, Salvador was heavy with silence. The rebellion had been crushed. The leaders were dead. The survivors were scarred. But silence is not the same as forgetting. In kitchens, in fields, in dark corners of the city, people whispered, "Did you hear how they fought? Did you hear how they refused to bow?" Even silence can carry a story, if hearts are willing to listen. What about the masters? Make no mistake, they were terrified. The rebellion revealed a truth they had long tried to ignore. They were outnumbered. The enslaved were the foundation of their wealth, their city, their society. And if that foundation cracked, everything would crumble. Letters from elites at the time speak in trembling tones. They beg for more troops, for harsher laws, for tighter control. Some even debated whether the entire system of slavery could survive if uprisings like this continued. In that fear lies another truth. The rebellion may have been crushed, but it exposed fragility of the entire empire chains. So let me ask you, when you picture those trials, those executions, whose side are you on? The judges in their robes, desperate to preserve order, or the rebels in their torn white garments? Standing proud even as the noose tightened? History books may have called them criminals. But tell me honestly, don't they sound more like freedom fighters? The consequences of the Bahia rebellion were written in chains and blood, but they were also written in memory, in whispers, in the courage passed down from generation to generation. And let us delve deeper into this memory, the legacy of the rebellion, the myths and legends that arose from it, and how its fire echoed throughout the Atlantic world, from Brazil to the Caribbean and the southern United States. Because the story of resistance is never limited to one night or one city. It travels, it inspires, it refuses to die. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a ship leaving Salvador's harbor. Its sails catch the wind, its hull heavy with coffee and sugar. The cargo will cross the Atlantic, destined for markets in London, New York, and Lisbon. But hidden within that cargo was something more dangerous than coffee or sugar. It was a story, a whisper about a rebellion, about enslaved men in white garments who dared to fight. A story carried not in documents but in voices, sailors retelling what they had heard, merchants murmuring to each other, enslaved Africans spreading the tale in secret. Stories travel, and sometimes stories are more powerful than armies. Think about the Caribbean in the 19th century, islands where sugar was king, where enslaved labor kept the gears of empire turning. The Haitian Revolution, just decades earlier, had shaken the world. It had proven that enslaved people could not only rebel but overthrow an empire and build a nation. That memory still haunted planners everywhere. Now, news of Bahia's uprising drifted into Caribbean ports. In whispered conversations, in coded songs, in the tense glances of overseers who suddenly tightened their grip. For the enslaved, the story of Bahia was a spark. If they fought in Brazil, maybe we can fight here. For the masters, it was a warning. This fire is spreading. Now shift your gaze northward to the United States. By the 1830s, slavery in America was under pressure. Abolitionist movements were growing in the North. Newspapers debated the morality of slavery. But in the South, cotton was booming, and slavery was defended as necessary. American merchants and sailors in Brazil heard whispers of the Bahia Revolt. Letters carried fragments of the story back to ports like New Orleans, Charleston, and New York. And imagine the impact. For abolitionists, the rebellion in Bahia was evidence that slavery was unsustainable, that people would always resist. For Southern slaveholders, it was a nightmare reminder that uprisings could erupt anywhere. One American planter, upon hearing of revolts in Brazil, was said to have confessed, "We sleep each night on a volcano, and the ground is always trembling." Britain, by then, had already abolished slavery in its colonies, 1833. But British ships and merchants still moved through Brazilian ports, still traded goods touched by slavery. British newspapers reported carefully on the Bahia Rebellion. Some framed it as evidence of Brazil's backwardness. Others treated it with fear, worried about instability in a key trade partner. But among British abolitionists, the story was fuel. It proved that slavery was not only immoral, it was dangerous, unstable, a constant threat to peace. And so, the echo of Bahia's rebellion entered parliamentary debates, sermons, pamphlets. It became one more piece of evidence in a global argument against slavery. Now imagine West Africa, the very homeland for which many of Bahia's rebels had come. Some of the captured rebels were deported back across the Atlantic. Exiled to Africa, they carried with them memories of resistance, scars of battle, stories of courage. In coastal towns, those stories mixed with local struggles against colonization, against slave traders, against internal wars. The idea that Africans in Brazil had risen in rebellion became part of a larger transatlantic memory. Our people fought there, too. This is how rebellion transcends geography. Chains may separate continents, but memory can bind them together again. Across oceans, one thing became clear. Slave societies lived in constant fear. Whether in Bahia, Jamaica, Cuba, or the American South, planters knew that the people they enslaved were not passive. They worked, they resisted, they dreamed, they fought. The Bahia Rebellion was proof that silence could shatter, that submission could erupt into fire. And so, the echo of Bahia was not just a story of resistance. It was a tremor in a global system built on human suffering. But how do you pass on forbidden stories when every word is watched? Through songs, through symbols, through religion. In Brazil, enslaved people remember the rebellion through chants and prayers, weaving references into rituals of candomblé and Islamic gatherings. In the Caribbean, drumming carried messages that overseers could not decode. In the United States, spirituals sung in the fields carried double meanings, songs of biblical deliverance that also spoke of real, earthly liberation. The Bahia Revolt entered that underground transmission. It became part of the hidden library of the enslaved, a collection of stories, songs, and secrets that kept hope alive. Let's step back. The 19th century was a century of revolutions, political, industrial, social. But alongside the revolutions of kings and parliaments, there were revolutions of enslaved. The Haitian Revolution, the Baptist War in Jamaica, Nat Turner's Rebellion in Virginia, and in Brazil, the Forgotten Uprisings of Bahia. Each was unique, but together they formed a chorus saying, "We are not property, we are people, and we will fight." When history is told only through empires and elites, that chorus is silenced. But if we listen carefully, we can still hear it. Here's something to reflect on. Brazil received more enslaved Africans than any other country in the Americas, over 4 million. The United States received less than 500,000. And yet, in American history books, slave rebellions like Nat Turner's are taught widely, while Bahia's uprisings remain hidden. Why? Because remembering Bahia would force us to see slavery as not just a national issue, but a global one. It would show us that the fight against slavery was never confined to borders. It was an Atlantic struggle, a shared resistance stretching from Africa to the Americas. The Atlantic was not just a highway of chains. It was also a bridge of defiance. So, what do we learn from the echo of Bahia's rebellion? That stories matter. That memory is resistance. That even when chains bind hands and whips tear flesh, the human spirit can still travel across oceans, across centuries. And maybe that's the most dangerous thing for any empire of oppression. Not the rebellion itself, but the echo it leaves behind. Because echoes do not die. They repeat, they remind, they awaken. The echo of Bahia's rebellion crossed oceans, unsettled empires, and entered the hidden archive of the enslaved. And we'll go deeper into that archive, into the myths and legends that grew from the rebellion. How enslaved people transformed pain into story, story into culture, and culture into survival. Because resistance is not only about weapons. Sometimes it's about memory. Picture the aftermath of the rebellion. The streets of Salvador are silent again, but the silence is heavy. Blood stains the cobblestones. The white garments once worn with pride now lie torn, crumpled in corners, soaked with death. On the surface, it looks like defeat, but memory is not so easily killed. Even as soldiers buried the dead, the living carried fragments of the rebellion inside them, secrets whispered in prayer, images imprinted in dreams. Every revolt, no matter how crushed, leaves behind an echo, and sometimes that echo turns into legend. When we think of archives, we imagine libraries, official records, dusty shelves of paper. But enslaved people had their own archives, invisible archives. They stored memory in songs that could be sung while working in the fields, in symbols carved quietly into wood, in prayers recited in Yoruba, Arabic, or Kikongo, in the rhythm of drums, where every beat carried a message no master could decode. These were not archives of ink. They were archives of survival. The Bahia Rebellion entered that hidden archive, not as dates and documents, but as spirit and story. Imagine a woman in Salvador, years after the uprising, rocking a child to sleep. She hums a lullaby, soft, repetitive. On the surface, it's just a cradle song. But hidden in the melody is a fragment of an old chant once sung before battle. A phrase that recalls a night when men in white marched through the city, daring to claim freedom. The child does not know the history yet, but grows up hearing it. The memory is passed on, disguised as music. Generations later, scholars listening to Afro-Brazilian folk songs would notice odd phrases, strange invocations. Were they lullabies or encrypted memories of rebellion? That's the power of song. It carries what cannot be openly spoken. Religion was one of the most powerful vehicles of memory. In Bahia, African Islam, practiced by the males, gave a rebellion structured discipline, even sacred purpose. Quranic verses written on amulets were worn into battle as shields of faith. But beyond Islam, other traditions preserve memory too. Candomblé ceremonies, blending African deities with Catholic saints, became spaces where enslaved people could retell their history, not with words, but with ritual, dance, trance. Every drumbeat could recall the heartbeat of the fallen. Every offering could honor a rebel ancestor. Every possession by a deity could be seen as a reminder. The spirit of resistance is still alive. Religion, forbidden and persecuted, became the safest vault of memory. Over time, A legend grew around the rebels' white clothing. To the authorities, it was a sign of conspiracy, uniforms of defiance. To the community, it became something else, a sacred costume, a reminder of purity, courage, sacrifice. Even today, in Bahia, white is worn during Afro-Brazilian ceremonies, on New Year's Eve, at candomblé rituals, at offerings to Yemanja, the goddess of the sea. Do most people know they are echoing the rebels of 1835? Maybe not, but the continuity is there. White became not just a color, but a vessel of memory. Enslaved communities often believed that those who died violently did not simply vanish. Their spirits lingered. And so, after the rebellion, stories spread of ghostly figures wandering Salvador's streets at night. Men in white, still marching, still fighting. Some said they appeared on stormy evenings, their voices blending with the wind. Others swore they heard phantom footsteps in the marketplace, as if the rebels had never left. These tales were not just superstition. They were coded remembrance, a way of saying they are gone but not forgotten. Their fight continues in the unseen world. Sometimes, memory hides not in what is spoken, but in what is not. In many Afro-Brazilian families, the rebellion was not openly discussed. Too dangerous, too painful, too risky. But silence itself became a form of preservation. When a child asked, "What happened that night?" the parent only sighed or shook their head or changed the subject. The absence of words carried weight. The silence told the child, something happened, something terrible, something powerful. Remember this absence. Even silence can be an archive. Over generations, the details of the rebellion blurred. Names were forgotten, dates confused, numbers exaggerated. But sometimes, myth preserves truth better than fact. Because myth does not need precision. It needs meaning. And the meaning of Bahia's rebellion, that enslaved people fought, resisted, dreamed of freedom, remained intact. So when oral tradition spoke of the night the city trembled, or the men of white who would not bow, it didn't matter if every detail matched the archives. The emotional truth survived. And emotional truth is what keeps people alive. Think of capoeira, the Afro-Brazilian martial art, disguised as dance. Enslaved people trained their bodies in rhythmic movement, hiding combat practice beneath music. Some scholars believe that echoes of rebellions like Bahia's lived on in capoeira, that the kicks and flips carried memories of resistance. The body itself became an archive. Every gesture, every swing, every song sung in a rota was a living footnote to a history written not on paper, but on flesh. To this day, when capoeira is performed, it is not only a game, it is an act of remembrance. So, why does all this matter? Because history written by rulers often erases the oppressed. But memory, carried in song, in ritual, in silence, in the body, refuses erasure. The Bahia Rebellion may not appear in every textbook, but in Bahia's music, in its rituals, in its streets, its presence lingers. The enslaved understood something powerful. If you cannot win the war today, you can preserve the story for tomorrow, and that preservation is itself a kind of victory. The rebellion was crushed, but was never erased. It lived on in the hidden archive of the enslaved, in songs, in rituals, in silence, in myth. And that hidden archive has outlasted the empire that tried to destroy it. We'll confront how the official history, the one written by the state, by elites, tried to bury the rebellion, and how the struggle between memory and silence shaped the way we understand slavery even today. Because history is not just about what happened. It's about who gets to tell the story. Let me ask you something. When you think of history, who do you imagine writing it? A scribe, maybe? A teacher? A government official? A historian in a university library? But here's the problem. History has rarely been written by the oppressed. More often, it has been written by those in power, those who want to control not only people's bodies, but also their memories. The Bahia Rebellion was no exception. From the moment the last rebel fell in Salvador, the authorities launched not only a military crackdown, but also a war against memory, because controlling memory is the surest way to control the future. After the rebellion was crushed, the Brazilian Empire wasted no time. Newspapers quickly published official accounts, describing the rebels as savages, criminals, fanatics. They emphasized chaos, blood, danger. The state wanted the public to see the rebels not as human beings fighting for freedom, but as monsters threatening order. Trials were staged not only to punish, but also to perform. Judges spoke in grand language, portraying the empire as merciful but firm, rational against irrational, civilization against barbarism. Do you see the pattern? This was not just law, it was propaganda. The empire was writing its own version of events, sealing it into official history. But the empire didn't just rewrite the story, it also enforced silence. Survivors of the rebellion were executed, imprisoned, or sold far away. Witnesses learned quickly. Speaking about that night was dangerous. Families avoided the subject. Churches refused to record details. Even some abolitionists at the time chose to look away, fearing that acknowledging violent resistance would undermine their respectable campaigns. So the rebellion slipped into silence. A silence of fear, a silence of shame, a silence imposed by power. Fast forward decades later. Imagine a Brazilian classroom in the early 1900s. The teacher writes on the blackboard, "The Empire of Brazil, a stable monarchy, order, progress, modernization." Students copy sentences about emperors, generals, battles with foreign nations. But what about the rebellion of enslaved Africans in Bahia? What about the night the city almost fell into the hands of the oppressed? Nothing, not a word. Textbooks skipped it. Teachers ignored it. Generations grew up never knowing. The rebellion was not just crushed in 1835. It was buried in silence for nearly a century. Why did the elites want to erase the rebellion? Because it was dangerous. Dangerous as an example. Dangerous as inspiration. Dangerous as proof that enslaved people were not passive victims, but conscious actors, organized, determined. If young black Brazilians in the late 1800s had learned about the Bahia Revolt, might they have risen again? If abolitionists in Europe had spoken openly about it, might global pressure have forced Brazil to end slavery earlier? The rulers knew memory can be more powerful than weapons, so they tried to bury it. But total erasure is impossible. Fragments survived. In court documents, carefully preserved. In letters written by terrified officials. In the whispers of Afro-Brazilian communities. Later, in the 20th century, historians digging through dusty archives began to find traces, arrest records, confiscated Qurans, testimonies extracted under torture. Piece by piece, they reconstructed the rebellion. But notice how it survived. Not as a living, proud memory, but as fragments hidden in the very documents of oppression. The state tried to erase, but in its obsession with control, it accidentally preserved evidence. And this silence wasn't just in Brazil. Think about the English-speaking world. In the 19th century, newspapers in London, New York, Boston wrote extensively about Brazil's coffee exports, about its royal court, about its ties to Europe. But the rebellion in Bahia? Barely a whisper. The silence was international, because colonial powers everywhere feared the same thing. If enslaved people in the Americas learned too much about each other's revolts, Haiti, Bahia, Jamaica, they might see themselves as part of a global uprising. So, each rebellion was treated as an isolated incident, local, marginal, forgettable. It was never forgettable to the people who lived it, but it was made invisible to the world. It took more than a century for scholars, writers, and activists to break that silence. In the 1960s and 70s, as civil rights movements spread across the world, interest in Afro-Brazilian history grew. Researchers uncovered forgotten files. Afro-Brazilian communities reclaimed oral traditions. Artists and musicians began to sing about the rebellion once again. And slowly, the silence cracked. The rebellion was no longer just a footnote in an archive. It was becoming part of collective memory again. But the struggle between erasure and remembrance continues even today. Because here's the truth. History is not fixed. It is contested. It is a battlefield. On one side, you have the forces of erasure, governments, elites, textbooks, sanitized narratives. On the other, the forces of memory, songs, rituals, community traditions, radical historians. The Bahia Rebellion stands at the center of this battle. If it is remembered, it tells us that slavery was never accepted, never stable, never legitimate. If it is forgotten, it allows the myth of a peaceful, paternalistic slavery to survive. That's the real fight, not just the rebellion itself, but the rebellion over its memory. And that brings us to now. Why should someone in the United States, the UK, Canada, or Australia care about a rebellion in Bahia almost 2 centuries ago? Because the mechanisms of erasure are global. Because the struggle over who gets to tell history is ongoing. Because silence about slavery is not just about the past. It shapes racism, inequality, and injustice in the present. The Bahia Rebellion asks us a haunting question. If a revolution can be erased once, how many others have we lost? And who benefits from that forgetting? The empire may have silenced the rebels with swords and prisons, but the greater violence came later. In the silence of classrooms, the gaps in textbooks, the erasures in national memory. To understand slavery, not as a passive condition, but as a battlefield of resistance, we must break that silence. And so, we will move beyond erasure to global connections, linking the Bahia Rebellion with other revolts across the Americas, from Haiti to Jamaica to the United States. Because only when we place these struggles side by side do we see the full scale of a truth empires tried so hard to hide. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture Bahia in 1835. Smoke rising, drums silenced, chains rattling. Now, open the frame wider. Because what happened in Bahia was not just a local fire. It was one spark in a vast, connected storm that swept across the Atlantic world. From the sugar field of Jamaica, to the rice plantations of South Carolina, to the cane fields of Haiti. Enslaved Africans were not simply enduring. They were resisting. Bahia was not an isolated rebellion. It was part of a network of memory, of courage, of defiance, stretching across oceans. We cannot speak of Bahia without first speaking of Haiti. In 1791, on a night thick with ceremony and fury, enslaved men and women of Saint-Domingue rose in rebellion. Within 13 years, they defeated Napoleon's armies, abolished slavery, and declared the first black republic in the modern world. The Haitian Revolution terrified slaveholders everywhere, in Brazil, in Jamaica, in the American South. For the enslaved, Haiti was a beacon, proof that resistance was not hopeless, that freedom was not a dream but a living reality. And Bahia, in 1835, carried that echo. Authorities in Brazil feared it. They knew enslaved Africans spoke of Haiti in whispers. Some even carried news of Toussaint Louverture and Dessalines across the ocean. Bahia was Haiti's ghost, walking in another land. Just 3 years before the Bahia Revolt, another fire raged in the British Caribbean. In December 1831, Samuel Sharp led the Baptist War in Jamaica, one of the largest uprisings in the history of the British Empire. Over 60,000 enslaved people joined. Plantations burned. The colonial order trembled. Though brutally suppressed, the revolt shook Britain to its core. It accelerated the abolition of slavery in the empire. Now imagine being an enslaved African Muslim in Bahia, hearing rumors of Jamaica. Imagine the inspiration, the courage, the sense that if they can rise, so can we. Revolts were not isolated explosions. They were conversations across the sea. And then there was the United States. In 1831, just 4 years before Bahia, Nat Turner led a rebellion in Virginia. Armed with visions he believed came from God, Turner and his followers struck terror into the slave-holding South. Dozens of whites were killed, but the rebellion was crushed and Turner executed. In the aftermath, the South tightened laws on literacy, religion, and movement. Fear of another Nat Turner haunted white slaveholders for decades. And in Bahia, 1835, when enslaved Muslims planned a revolt, authorities drew comparisons with Turner. They saw the same patterns: organization, faith, conviction, a willingness to strike at the heart of slavery. The rebellion spoke to each other, even if across silence and rumor. Think of the Atlantic Ocean not as a barrier, but as a highway. Ships carried not just goods and human beings. They carried news, stories, fragments of songs, rumors of rebellions. Enslaved Africans arriving in Bahia often had heard whispers of Haiti before they left Africa. Sailors, merchants, and abolitionists carried tales of uprisings from port to port. This was the Atlantic Underground, an invisible network of resistance, linking people who never met but who dreamed the same dream. Bahia was one stop on that network. Haiti another, Jamaica another, Virginia another. Together, they formed a constellation of fire. Notice the similarities. In Jamaica, rebels used coded messages in hymns and church meetings. In Bahia, they used Quranic verses, written in Arabic, hidden in pockets and sewn into clothing. In Virginia, Nat Turner relied on biblical visions. Different faiths, different languages, but the same core, a belief that God or justice or destiny was on their side. Religion became not only a source of comfort, but a weapon of resistance. And across the Americas, enslaved people drew strength from these connections, whether through Christianity, Islam, or African spiritual traditions. The rebellions were connected, and so were the fears of empires. Brazil watched Jamaica, the U.S. watched Bahia, Britain watched Haiti. Every empire feared the same thing. That resistance would spread like wildfire. That's why newspapers downplayed revolts. That's why authorities censored letters, banned gatherings, increased surveillance. They knew if enslaved people saw themselves as part of global movement, the system would collapse. And they were right. But let's go further still. Because these rebellions were not just Atlantic events. They were also African. Many of the rebels in Bahia were Yoruba, Hausa, or Nego, peoples who had already lived through wars, revolts, and resistance in Africa before being enslaved. They carried that memory with them. In some sense, the Bahia Rebellion was not only an echo of Haiti or Jamaica, it was also a continuation of African resistance, transplanted to the Americas. The fight was global. So, what do we learn from these global connections? First, that resistance was never marginal. It was central. Slavery was not an uncontested system. It was a battlefield. Second, that memory is dangerous. That's why empires try to isolate these stories, treating them as accidents instead of threads in a larger fabric. And third, that freedom was always imagined globally. The enslaved in Bahia dreamed not only of their own liberation, but of joining a wave that stretched from Africa to the Caribbean to North America. They were not alone. They never were. And here's where it touches you. If you live in the United States, your history of slavery is bound up with Bahia's. If you live in the UK, your empire feared both Jamaica and Brazil. If you live in Canada or Australia, your nation's wealth grew in a world shaped by this system. The rebellions of the past are not foreign. They are part of the same global story that shaped the modern world. Bahia was one chapter, but the book belongs to all of us. The Bahia Rebellion was not just a Brazilian tragedy. It was part of a global epic of resistance. Haiti's victory, Jamaica's fire, Virginia's vision, Bahia's courage. Each was a verse in the same song of freedom. And even today, when we hear that silence in history books, we must listen harder, for the echoes are still there. In We Turn to Consequences and Legacies, what happened after the rebellion, how it shaped Brazil's path toward abolition, and how its memory continues to haunt the present. Dawn broke over Salvador on January 25th, 1835. The smoke had cleared, the drums were silent, and the blood on the cobblestones had begun to dry. The male rebellion was crushed. But what came next was not peace. It was fear. Fear in the minds of the enslaved, who knew punishment was coming. Fear in the minds of slaveholders who realized, perhaps for the first time, that their control was fragile. The immediate aftermath was brutal. In the hours after the revolt, soldiers and militias swept through Salvador. They raided homes, dragged men and women into the streets, tore through mosques and prayer rooms, searching for Qurans, amulets, or scraps of Arabic writing. Anyone suspected of involvement was arrested. Over 500 people were taken into custody. Many were enslaved. Some were freed Africans. A few were even Brazilian-born, though the rebellion was largely driven by African Muslims. The interrogations were vicious. Prisoners were whipped, shackled, starved until they confessed or until they died. Authorities wanted not just justice. They wanted to make an example. The colonial court in Bahia moved quickly. Some prisoners were sentenced to death, others to hundreds of lashes. Many were deported, sent back to Africa, not to freedom, but to uncertain exile. One of the most chilling sentences was public execution. Leaders of the revolt were hanged in the central square, their bodies displayed as warnings. The message was clear: defy the system and you will be erased. But here's the hidden truth. Even in death, they were not erased. Their names, like Pacifico Locutan, a Muslim cleric believed to be one of the leaders, still survive in fragments of testimony. Their courage echoed in whispers among the enslaved, even when silence was forced. Punishment was not limited to those who fought. Slaveholders across Bahia imposed harsher rules on all enslaved people. Curfews tightened, gatherings were banned. Religious ceremonies, especially Muslim prayers, were forbidden. Free Africans, too, felt the weight. Some were stripped of their property, others deported simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The system responded not just with repression, but with paranoia. To understand the consequences, we have to see the bigger picture. By 1835, Brazil was the largest slaveholding nation in the world. Over 1.5 million enslaved people lived in bondage, nearly half the population. The empire depended on slavery. Coffee, sugar, cotton, all relied on African labor. And so, when the male rebellion erupted, the fear was existential. What if Bahia was just the beginning? What if rebellion spread to Rio de Janeiro, to Sao Paulo, to the vast plantations of the Paraíba Valley? The empire tightened control. Police forces expanded. Laws restricted the movement of Africans. Newspapers downplayed the revolt, calling it a disturbance, minimizing its scale so as not to inspire others. The rebellion was buried under silence. But silence is not the same as forgetting. Among the enslaved, the memory lived on in whispers, in songs, in the scars of those who survived. Some spoke of the rebellion as a failure. Others saw it as proof of possibility. And among the elites, the memory became a ghost, a reminder that their empire was built on fragile foundations. For decades after, Bahia remained a place of suspicion. African Muslims were closely monitored. Slaveholders carried the fear of another uprising like a shadow they could not escape. The male rebellion did not end slavery, but it planted seeds. When abolitionist movements grew stronger in the late 19th century, the memory of past revolts gave weight to their arguments. It showed that slavery was not stable, not natural, not eternal. Revolts, from Palmares in the 1600s to the males in 1835, revealed slavery's cracks. By 1888, when Brazil finally abolished slavery, the last country in the Western Hemisphere to do so, those cracks had widened into collapse. And though the males were long dead by then, their rebellion was part of the pressure that made freedom inevitable. Here's the paradox. For nearly 2 centuries, Brazilian history books barely mentioned the male rebellion. When they did, it was often as a footnote, a failed plot, nothing more. This erasure was deliberate. To acknowledge the rebellion was to acknowledge that enslaved Africans were thinkers, planners, fighters, that they were not passive victims but agents of history. And yet, memory survived. In Salvador, in the neighborhoods where the revolt began, people still told stories. Families passed down whispers. Scholars eventually unearthed trial records, piecing together what had been hidden. Today, the rebellion is remembered not as failure, but as testimony. The consequences were not only Brazilian. Slaveholders in the United States, in the Caribbean, in Cuba, all watched Bahia with alarm. The lesson was clear. No matter how harsh the chains, resistance was always possible. And for abolitionists abroad, the rebellion was evidence. Slavery was unsustainable because it demanded constant violence to suppress those enslaved. The male rebellion joined the global archive of resistance alongside Haiti, Jamaica, and Nat Turner's Virginia. Take a deep breath with me. Picture those men and women in Bahia in 1835, standing before the gallows, or before the lash, or before the long road into exile. They knew the price. They knew they would likely fail. And still, they chose to rise. That choice, made in the darkness of Brazilian night nearly 2 centuries ago, still speaks to us today. It tells us that freedom is never given. It is taken. It tells us that silence can bury a story, but cannot kill it. And it tells us that even in the most brutal systems, human beings will always imagine something different. The consequences of the male rebellion were punishment, repression, silence. But the legacy is defiance, courage, memory. And that legacy is ours to carry forward. The male rebellion did not topple slavery, but it cracked the mask of invincibility that slaveholders wore. Its consequences were immediate and brutal. Its legacy is eternal. In the final chapter, we will step into the afterlife of silence, how this forgotten story shapes Brazil today, how the ghosts of slavery linger, and why remembering is itself a radical act. If you walk through the streets of Salvador today, Pelourinho, Comercio, the old quarters where the stones still carry centuries of footsteps, you might not notice it at first. The pastel walls, the sound of drums, the scent of acreage frying in palm oil. Salvador feels alive, colorful, vibrant. But if you listen carefully, beneath the music and the laughter, you can hear something else. A silence layered with centuries of memory. That silence is not emptiness. It is a presence. It is the afterlife of the male rebellion. History is not just what happened. It's also what was chosen to be remembered. The male rebellion was buried in archives, described as a minor uprising, stripped of names, stripped of dignity. This erasure was not an accident. It was a tool of control. Because if you erase memory, you erase inspiration. If you bury rebellion, you bury the possibility that others might rise again. Silence was the second weapon of slavery. Chains bound the body. Silence bound the story. But here we are, nearly 2 centuries later, speaking their names aloud. By remembering, we are breaking the silence that the empire of Brazil tried to enforce. And when silence breaks, something powerful happens. The past stops being past. It becomes present. Think about this. Slavery depended on forgetting. Slaveholders wanted enslaved people to forget their language, their religion, their names, their stories. And yet, memory survived. Muslim Africans in Bahia prayed in Arabic. They wore amulets with verses of Quran. They taught each other secretly, passing literacy from hand to hand. Even in chains, they carried memory. And that memory became rebellion. If you're listening to this in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Canada, in the Caribbean, you might feel this echo too, because silence is global, and so is resistance. In Virginia, Nat Turner's rebellion was silenced by executions and censorship. In Jamaica, Tacky's revolt was silenced by colonial terror. In Cuba, conspiracies in Havana were silenced by fire and noose. The male rebellion is part of the same pattern, a web of memory and forgetting that stretches across the Atlantic. To tell this story is to reweave the web, to connect what was deliberately torn apart. Slavery was abolished in Brazil in 1888. But listen carefully, the chains did not vanish. They changed form. Poverty, racism, police violence, inequality, these are the afterlife of chains. Walk through Salvador today, and you will see a city of music and beauty, yes, but also a city where the descendants of the enslaved are still pushed to the margins, where silence is still imposed in new ways. This is not coincidence. It is continuity. Let me ask you something. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture a young enslaved man in Bahia in 1835. He has fasted for days, prayed with his brothers, tied his white turban, hidden a dagger beneath his robe. He knows that by dawn he will likely be dead, and still he walks into the night. Now open your eyes. Can you feel him? Can you sense the weight of his choice? That choice lives inside us. It asks, what do we do with our freedom when others died for it? This is not just a Brazilian story. It is a human story. Because every society has its silences. Every nation has its buried rebellions. And when we break silence, whether in Bahia, in Alabama, in Jamaica, in London, we make the buried visible. We remind ourselves that history is not distant. It is living inside us. Here's the truth. The males lost the battle, but they won something greater. They forced us, centuries later, to remember them. They forced us to face the horror of slavery not as numbers, but as lives. They forced us to admit that silence is complicity. And once we remember, we cannot go back to ignorance. Memory becomes responsibility. So here we are, you listening now, me telling this story, and the males still walking with us in the silence of Salvador's streets. What do we do with this memory? Do we let it fade, as the empire once intended? Or do we carry it forward into our conversations, our classrooms, our politics, our daily lives? The choice is ours. But remember, silence is never neutral. Silence always takes a side. The males chose to break silence with rebellion. We can choose to break silence with remembrance. The night of January 24th, 1835, ended in blood and defeat. But the story does not end there. Because every time we speak of the forgotten rebellion of Bahia, every time we refuse the comfort of silence, every time we honor those who rose when rising meant death, we keep the fire alive. And that fire is freedom's afterlife.